structures, Dreyer, states that cross-linguistically there are essentially 7 types of restrictive relative clauses that we are going to see briefly under 1. By restrictive relative clause, I mean a sentence that modifies a nominal constituent, the head of the relative clause, and narrows down and helps to single out the reference of the head, narrowing down this reference by adding further specifications. So that, so it's like an intersection of 2 sets. When you, if I say the book that I bought yesterday, it's an intersection between the sets of books and the set of things that I bought yesterday. And this helps me to single out exactly the, if I did the right calculation that I know my addressee would understand that, to narrow down the reference of the head. Now, in addition to restrictive finite relative clauses, there are also non-restrictive relative clauses, which I will not really talk about. I cited one paper where there's more discussion, where the relative clause in that case does not narrow down the reference of the head, which is already independently, autonomously singled out, like John, who is a nice fellow. Here, who is a nice fellow does not help to single out the referent of John, which is already given. And then there is a third, in addition to this semantic differentiation, there is a third case of a relative clause which used to be under the put under the restrictive class, which is called the amount relative clause, especially from the work of Carlson, semanticist. I just give you one example. You have the pen here. Right. So if I write down so if I say something like that, it will take us the whole week to drink the wine that was spilled yesterday at the party. We don't understand this sentence in the way that normal restrictive relatives are understood, namely the substance wine, but rather the amount of wine, because the wine had already been spilled. So unless you imagine scenario where you go and lick the wine that was spilled, that's not the interpretation that is given. So this is the amount type of interpretation that Carlson discussed, and there are also specific constructions like the existential there construction that share properties with this interpretation, and that Carlson treated differently from ordinary restrictive relatives. Now, let me go back to then the 7 types of relatives that are singled out by Dreyer. So in 1A, you have the English type, the externally headed postnominal. In 1B, you have the externally headed prenominal that you find in some languages of the head final type. Then you have the so-called internally headed relative clause, where the head, curiously, is not external to the relative clause, but it's internal. And in Quechua, Cole shows very clearly, given the different case marking of the head, so that in C, the head gets accusative, which is the case that the object of by inside the relative clause would assign. So clearly that is internal to the relative clause. And as he says, in many languages, externally headed prenominal and internally headed are both possible. We'll come back to this case. Then you have the so-called double-headed in 1D, then the headless, in the sense that it doesn't seem to have an external or internal head. In fact, it has only a WH element, the headless or free. So in 1E, what you did is nice. You seem to have only a WH phrase, relative pronoun, and no head around. Then the correlative, typical of a number of Indo-Aryan languages, but not only, as in 1F, which translates into English literally as which girl standing is, that girl tall is, to mean the girl that is standing is tall. And so it's one way to express the same. And then the well-known case that was studied by Ken Hale of some Australian languages that he dubbed as a joint, namely where the relative clause is non-adjacent to the head. So the head is emu, the yankiri, the emu, and the relative clause follows the verb of the main clause. And this also has another interpretation that does not bear immediately to our concerns. Now, within the generative, let me say first that what I will try to do is to show that actually these 7 types of restrictive relative clauses seem to be variants of one and the same double-headed structure, so that they can be derived from one single structure by independently motivated, or which can be motivated, movement or deletion operations, so that we can hope to find a single structure for this construction, the relativization. Within the generative tradition, there are 2 or actually 3 main analyses of restrictive relatives. One is the so-called raising analysis, whereby you start out with, let's say, TP, which is headed by a determiner, and then directly by a sentence, the relative clause, which contains the head that raises to the specifier of the reason. So if you have something like the, I read book, the object within the relative clause raises to the specifier of C, or maybe to some position external, if there are 2 variants, possible variants. What is crucial to this analysis is that the overt head that you see, or here, is connected by this movement to the internal position of the relative clause. And relative clauses are, within the generative tradition, taken to necessarily have a position inside the relative clause that is related to the external head or to the head of the relative clause itself. The traditional one, the traditional let me just simplify here. Analysis is of the head external, which is matched by a head internal kind of relative head, which gets either deleted or reduced into a relative pronoun. And these are the two main analyses, the head internal that raises, or the double head with the internal one being reduced or deleted. More recently, some people have claimed that we need both. And actually, I will also adopt the position that we need both the raising analysis and the so-called head external or matching, more precisely, analysis, where you have a match between the internal and external head. And that these may be related to different semantic properties of the head themselves, as we will see. Now, I will only give you a couple of examples of the arguments that have been given for the raising, so-called raising analysis. So there are, in fact, constructions, relative clause constructions, where the head seems to have to be reconstructed within the relative clause itself, for a number of reasons. Which means reconstructed means that it has a special relation to the verb or to some other element within the relative clause itself. And so it should not be generated outside of the relative clause, because otherwise we could not capture this very strict relation that there is between the head and something within the relative clause. Let me give you a couple of examples. So, for example, with idioms, like we made headway, progress, one cannot use headway for the majority of speakers unless it's coupled with the verb make. So, to be the headway or headway was satisfactory is bad. So, headway has to be born together with make as the object of make. So, the fact that in 2C, the headway that we made was satisfactory is a possible relative clause, seems to suggest that headway starts out as the object of make and then acquires the status of an external head, so to speak. But it's only an illusion. It actually is inserted within the relative clause and then it's moved out, or at the beginning of the relative clause. Other arguments that have been given have to do with anaphor binding. For example, 3a, here you have an anaphor, a reflexive pronoun himself, that typically in English has to be bound by an antecedent within the same clause. And here, bound means that the antecedent has to secomand, be higher up than the reflexive himself. So in general, you cannot say himself likes John, you can only say John likes himself, because the antecedent has to be higher up and secomand the reflexive. But here, if we generated the head outside of the relative clause, himself would not be secomanded by its antecedent, namely John, within the relative clause. Only if the opinion of himself starts out within the relative clause, then you can satisfy the requirement of binding of this reflexive. 3b gives another case, slightly different, where we talk about variable binding, where his, of the picture of his mother, varies with the choice that we make of every soldier, the subject of the relative clause, so that it does not refer to a single person, individual, but varies with the varying of every soldier. So it is bound semantically by the quantifier every soldier. And once again, this kind of binding requires that the antecedent with every soldier, C commands, is higher up than his, in this particular case, so that once again, the picture of his mother must be generated within the object of kept and then moved to the beginning of the sentence. 3C gives another case that is often given, where you have an interaction between two quantifiers, so that in general, within a single sentence, when you say every doctor examined 2 patients, you have an ambiguity. It can be that there are only 2 patients, the same ones, that every doctor examined, or that there are 2 patients different depending on each doctor. So each doctor visited 2 patients, but they were different from the patients visited by the other doctor. Once again, to have this kind of interpretation where 2, which is higher up, actually is under the scope of every doctor, of every, means that it has to reconstruct within the relative clause to be able to give rise to this interpretation. So once again, we have apparent evidence that, semanticists that also give an alternative analysis, but this is also one possibility that you have to reconstruct, namely to generate 2 patients within the relative clause and then move them up. However, there are also indications that raising, it cannot be the only derivation of restrictive relative clauses, even though this has been claimed by a number of people recently, and that you only have the raising derivation of relative clauses. The reason is that if you consider certain particular construction, extraposition, namely the fact that the relative clause is not adjacent to the head. For example, in 4a, I read a book during the vacation which was written by Chomsky. Now, which was written by Chomsky is a relative clause modifying a book, but it's not adjacent to the book. And this is called extraposition. This sometimes is said to have a restriction on the indefinite or definite, but there are cases where the extraposition is also possible, as you see in 7b and 7c, with definite heads. So there is no problem in taking extraposition to be more general, not only with indefinite heads. Now, if you pick bona fide cases of raising that have been discussed by Carlson, that I said, namely free relatives seem to involve movement of the WH. We saw earlier in 1e, what you did is nice. What has to be generated within the relative clause, it's within the relative clause itself, it's a WH that moves to the specifier of the complementizer phrase, and so it has to move from the object position to this first position within the relative clause. Free relatives, their construction, existential, their context seem to be sensitive to movement, as Carlson has shown. The relativization of a predicate also, so for example, the gifted mathematician that Bill was is very rare nowadays. When you relativize on a predicate, it seems that you have to move actually the head from the position of the predicate. And also measure phrases, degree relatives that have been discussed by Carlson seem to involve this kind of raising. Now, if you look at page 2 at the cases that I put under 8AH, which contain either a free relative or an existential there context or a relativization of a predicate, then you see that this kind of extraposition is impossible. So while you see, let me just run over some of these cases. So while you can say whatever friends I once had or that I once had are gone, you cannot say 8a, whatever friends are gone I once had. So when you cannot extrapose the relative clause in this particular case. Or in the case of the relativization of a predicate, while you can say the gifted mathematician that Bill was is very rare nowadays, if you try to extrapose, you get a bad sentence. So you cannot say the gifted mathematician is very rare nowadays that Bill was. That's judged impossible. Or the example that Haycock gives in 8D, the one thing that I want a man to be is honest, fine, but not the one thing is honest that I want a man to be. That's completely out. So extraposition is one case that seems to show that whenever there is independent reason for the raising analysis, you cannot do extraposition anymore. Which means that where you can do it, then it must not be a raising analysis of the relative clause, it must be an external head analysis. I'll come back to that. One particular striking case of the impossibility of extraposition in one interpretation of inverse case attraction is given by one Farsi variety which was studied back in the 70s, and the author had very carefully noted that you can extrapose unless you have inverse case attraction. What is inverse case attraction? The inverse case attraction here is the fact that the head of the relative clause, instead of showing the case given by the matrix verb, shows the case that the verb within the relative clause would assign to the internal head. So if you look at 13a and b, you see the difference. So you have both possibilities in this variety of Farsi. So you have the girl the, nominative, there is no morphology for nominative. Then you have the relative clause following, that John knows is here. And the girl seems to be assigned nominative by the predicate is here, because it's a subject of that predicate, so it gets nominative. If it were the object of no, it should be in the accusative, because no assigns accusative. But as you see in 13b, the head of the relative clause can also appear with accusative, which is called traditionally inverse case attraction. But if you think of it, it's not particularly surprising. You only need to assume that the head of the relative clause was born within the relative clause and moved out, carrying along the accusative case that was assigned by the internal verb of the relative clause. Now, the interesting thing for our purposes is that the author notes that while you can extrapose the relative clause if the subject is in the nominative, you cannot do it if the subject is in the accusative. So that clearly seems to suggest that, as we saw earlier, whenever there is reason to believe that what you see as the external head comes from within the relative clause, because it bears the case given by the verb of the relative clause, then you have the raising analysis, and then extraposition is blocked for whatever reason now I won't enter into possible. The same thing appears also in the Iranian Farsi Persian. I don't go through this is in a much later dissertation that discusses the same facts for Persian. And very strikingly, the same thing also was noticed back in the 70s by one author for an Albanian dialect. So if you look at 18a, you have the same situation. So here, the subject of the boy that I saw left, the boy, the subject of the matrix verb left, which is the head of the relative clause, that I him saw, there is a resumptive pronoun there, can be nominative, 18a, but it can also, and so here and it can also, if you look at 19a, it can also be in the accusative. Here I put them in two different orders, but it doesn't matter. So in the inverse case attraction case, again, the head of the relative clause bears the accusative that cannot be assigned by the matrix verb, which assigns nominative to its subject, but it's in the accusative assigned by the internal verb. So once again, we can think of this coming out as a consequence of the raising of the internal head. Now, I should add that both in the Farsi cases and the Albanian cases, there are restrictions. You cannot do it in all contexts. It's only when something is left dislocated that you can have this, not within the relative clause, but it doesn't matter. It means that the raising analysis is only possible. So this mismatch of case between what looks like the subject of the matrix verb in the accusative and the matrix verb which should assign nominative is when the whole relative clause is actually dislocated, so that it's in a position of its own, and then one can kind of conjecture that there is an empty subject which receives the nominative, which is connected to the left dislocated DP, which contains the relative clause. I don't know if that is clear, but so now once again, even in this dialect, the author notes that you can extrapose 18b when the subject bears nominative, so where we don't assume that there is the raising derivation, because otherwise you should have the accusative there. But when you have the accusative 19b, then extraposition is impossible, once again. So we seem to have pretty strong evidence that whenever we have independent reason to assume that what we see as the external head of the relative clause was actually introduced within the relative clause and moved out, then extraposition becomes impossible. Which, on the other hand, suggests that whenever extraposition is possible, the construction must not be a raising construction, because otherwise we could not understand why in certain cases you can extrapose, in certain other cases where we have evidence of the raising analysis you cannot. The stacking is another construction that seems to discriminate between the two derivations, the raising one and the matching or head external one. So what is stacking? In 22 you have a rough, first definition. So relative clauses are said to be stacked if a structure exists such that the first clause modifies the head noun and the second modifies the head noun as already modified by the first clause. It actually continues the quotation saying a third relative clause can be added. So one case is given in 23a. The only article that he wrote of which he is not ashamed is such and such, is this one. Or 23b, the first book that I read that really amused me was Alice in Wonderland, let's say. Now here, it's not a hidden coordination of the two relatives. The second relative modifies the union of the head plus the first relative. If it were a hidden coordination, we could get the wrong interpretation. So the first book that I read that really amused me cannot mean that Alice in Wonderland is the first book that I read, because it can be another book that I read first. But it's the first one that I read that really amused me. So that really amused me modifies the first book then. Now, in this kind of, in the same context that we saw earlier, did not allow for extraposition, namely free relatives. Here I added also the free relative within correlatives, 24b, the existential there context, 24c, and the idiom chunk, 24d. Remember that an idiom is also a case that betrays the raising nature of the relative clause. Then it has been noted that in no one of these cases you can have stacking. So it seems that stacking is only possible if you don't have a raising derivation of the relative clause. And 24E, F, G, E give other examples. Now, going a bit quicker, with the third case is weak island sensitivity. Now, weak islands are constructions that very roughly allow you to extract a referential kind of DP, but they don't allow you to extract, for example, an adjunct, to extract something that does not have a referential kind of. And once again, it seems that idiom chunks that are typical of this amount reading non-referential type cannot be extracted, and so for the other cases. I skip over because it's kind of boring and get to the analysis that I want to give, which, as I said earlier, must be an analysis not only that tries to give a unitary analysis of the 7 types. We will actually see that they're not, I mean, the basic ones are 4, in the sense that the other 3 are never the only relative clause type that you find in a language. So there are 4 that are the core cases of relative clauses, and we'll see that they can be given a unitary analysis, both in the raising and in the matching derivations. That's the idea. So this unitary analysis must account for the 2 types of derivations, raising or raising, and also for the different types, externally headed prenominal, externally headed postnominal, internally headed, and headless, and double-headed. Now, the idea, as I said earlier, is that I also assume that the basic structure of relative clauses has 2 heads, namely an external one and an internal one. So the relative clause has to contain, there is a tradition where some sentences are claimed not to force the presence of a co-referential head within the relative clause with respect to the external relative clause. I leave this aside. There is a debate as to whether this is true or not. So I will assume that within a relative clause there is always a head that matches the external head. And that makes it obvious, at least in our languages, the fact that you cannot say the book that I bought a copybook yesterday is nice, where you have 2 separate different heads, one external and one internal. That's impossible. The first assumption is that you have one external head and one internal head. Now the question is, given what I said so far, namely that within the extended projection of the DP that we will look at in more detail in the next presentation, the NP, the core of the construction, is the lowest element, and everything else, all the modifiers and heads, are piled up on top of it. So adjectives, numerals, demonstratives, relative clauses, they are all piled up in a certain order. And it looks as if one looks cross-linguistically and teases apart certain counterexamples, that restrictive relative clauses, as opposed to non-restrictives, are located between the determiner or the demonstrative and the cardinal numerals. Certain languages show that very clearly. In head-final languages, very common position of restrictive relative clauses is between the pre-nominal demonstrative and the pre-nominal numeral. Clearly, restrictive relatives have to be closed up by a determiner semantically, so that makes sense. And there must be some semantic sense for the fact that weak, so-called weak quantifiers, namely numeral, cardinal numerals, focal and multiple quantifiers and adjectives, are actually below the position of the restrictive relative clause. So you see that in 31, where the location, remember that I took everything to be introduced in specifiers of of a certain functional head. You should not take this as already linearized. This is, it's three-dimensional, let's say. It's like a mobile. It's obviously in a paper you cannot represent the three-dimensionality, so you have to put it in 2 dimensions, which gives you order, but think of it in terms of non-ordering. And the kind of movements and deletion that we'll see are partly specific to the construction, partly are due to the nature of the language, whether it's head initial or head final. You remember from yesterday that head initial languages move in a certain way the core of the construction, the NP, with the whose picture type piping. They cross over the modifiers that are above the NP. And head final languages, on the other hand, they don't cross over. They, by piping in the other mode, the picture of whom, they bring along the modifiers that are above them without reversing the order. So now, let me say another couple of things about 31. I put a small dp1 and small dp2 to indicate the external head and the internal head. Think of these as being indefinite portions of the extended projection of the nominal phrase, and they are exact matches. That's the other point. So dp1 and dp2 are exact matches, and in particular, given the fact that the relative clause is introduced at a certain height of the structure, the external head is dp1. So whatever is secomanded by the relative clause is the head of the relative clause. So the relative clause modifies what is below it. It does not modify what is higher up. It modifies only the elements that it secommands. modification implies sequence. One consequence of this is that because the strong quantifiers, or the strong determiners in semantic terms, namely definite article, demonstratives, universal quantifiers, most, and some other quantifiers are above the relative clause, it's never the case that they reconstruct within the relative clause. For example, if you say all of the books that I read of Chomsky, all does not reconstruct within, is not inserted within the relative clause and moves out, because then you would interpret it as that you read all the books of Chomsky. But when you say all the books of Chomsky that I read, does not mean that you read all of them are nice, but only the part of those that you read, and you are saying that all of them have a certain property. Or if you say, no one that I saw yesterday was drunk, I don't know, was tall. It does not mean that you saw no one. It only means that those that you saw were not drunk. So the no one is not inserted within the relative clause and move out, but is generated outside. So this is the preamble. The crucial thing is that given that the two heads, the external one and the internal one, are exact matches, the fact that the external one can only host indefinite quantifiers forces the fact that the internal head also cannot contain demonstratives, universal quantifiers, a definite article, and so on. Okay, let's now move then to the way of accounting for the two possible derivations, the raising and the no-raising, for the externally headed postnominal, which is given in 32. Now, here, simplifying, I just have one NP books. Under the raising analysis, recall that the raising analysis has the property that the head that you hear or that you see is in a chain, was born within the relative clause and was moved up. And so there is a link between the overt relative clause, head of the relative clause and the position within the relative clause itself. This means, for example, that the derivation is sensitive to island constraints. You know what an island constraint is? That you cannot move out of certain constructions, like an adjunct clause, or a relative clause, or subject clause. These are islands, nothing can move out. And these are diagnostics of movement, because when you see that the relation between one position outside of an island and a position inside of an island is impossible, it means that the element which is outside has come out from the island. There are cases where instead there is no problem in connecting something outside of the island and inside. For example, a pronominal can well connect to something outside of an island. I can say John said that before he could, no problem in interpreting he co-referential with John, although he is within an island. But I cannot say, who did John say that before went out? Where who is the subject of went out? It's completely impossible, because that's an island. So this is one first consequence. So if the overt head is the internal head, then you expect sensitivity to islands, first consequence. So look at 32. This is depicting the case where you have the raising derivation. For example, if you had an idiom chunk, that would be the only possibility to move headway from inside to the beginning of the relative clause. And now the movement to that position, which under a certain definition of C commands the external head. So suppose that this allows you to delete the external head by the internal head that moved up high enough to delete the external head. Then the surviving head is the internal head. The matching analysis is slightly more complex because here, look at 34, in a language like Italian or English, you first have movement of the internal head because the relativization is still sensitive to islands. But then what happens is that before the deletion of the external head moves up. And this is typical of head initial languages. Remember that in head initial languages you have these movements, and there is a well-known correlation that pre-nominal relative clauses are found in head final languages, whereas the presence of post-nominal relative clauses, which is typical of head initial, is also found in some head final, but crucially there is a relation between head finality and head initiality, and whether the relative clause is pre-nominal or post-nominal. In this case, English or Italian behave as head initial type, where the external head moves to the left of the relative clause, so that you have a post-nominal relative clause in the end when you linearize. And so here is the external head that has deleted, that deletes the internal, the internal head that has moved up. What is the consequence of that? Now the consequence is that the head that you hear, the overt head, is no longer directly connected to the internal position. It's connected to the external one. So you should not expect reconstruction with respect to, for example, a quantifier, with respect to himself, with respect to an idiom chunk, and so on. Depending on the language, you may or may not have sensitivity to islands if the internal head also moves. But there are, and if you go to 40, and I go back then to 35 and 36, is a case where here, where you have resumptive pronouns. Now here languages differ as to whether you have sensitivity to islands even with resumptive pronouns. Generally, in say Italian or Bulgarian or Irish, when you have a resumptive pronoun, a pronoun inside a relative clause that matches the external head, there is no island sensitivity. So you can say something like, the book that I went out after reading it, there is no problem. The resumptive pronoun is generated within the relative clause, and there is no internal movement. But there are languages, apparently Swedish, that employs resumptive pronouns, can employ in relative clauses, and yet, even in the presence of a resumptive pronoun, you have island sensitivity, which betrays the fact that there must be movement there, even in the presence of a resumptive pronoun. Quickly going back to the previous page, the internal head, in the case of 34, may be deleted completely, and that's the case in 35A, the books that I bought. Or it can be reduced, 35B, the books which I bought. So you have a relative pronoun that is a placeholder together with the internal head, and that is the only piece of the internal head that survives. So it's reduced, not completely. And this can also appear in certain varieties together with the complementizer. So in Middle English, you could say 36a, which that. So in modern editions, what can my dear heart say to me, which that I fear never to see again? And there are other languages where you have both a relative pronoun and a complementizer co-occurring. So that is, again, a parametric difference among languages. Now let's go to the next externally headed pre-nominal relative clauses. We start out with the same structure. Now, what happens as before, you can have in the raising analysis, you can have movement of the internal head that deletes the external one, but then you have to assume movement of the remnant above the raised internal head. And notice that if that is correct, if there is movement within this type of pre-nominal externally headed relative clauses, you expect sensitivity to islands, because there is movement inside the relative clause. And this seems to be the case of Chinese, which has been reported to have sensitivity to islands and reconstruction, for example, of idiom chunks. So there are cases of an idiom which is an external head of an externally headed pre-nominal. So that must have come from within the pre-nominal relative clause. So that's shown in 41. And maybe in modern Tamil, if Annamalai and Steve are right in saying that they are sensitive to islands, they are also pre-nominal. Now, the matching case would be much simpler, and I would try to compare it to VP deletion. The fact that when you have two VPs, you can delete one or the other. So you can say, before I left, he did, or before he did, I left. Where did is did leave, you delete leave, and you have both regressive or progressive deletion. And here it's the same thing. So here you have, at least for the part that deletes progressively, you have the case in 42 where, no, that's already internally headed. Look at 42 by doing the opposite. So the matching case is a case where of an externally headed pre-nominal relative clause where you delete the internal head, so it's the opposite of 42, by the external one, much, because they don't circumvent each other, much like with VP deletion that I said. And notice that now you expect also the possibility of doing the opposite, as in VP deletion, namely where the internal head deletes the external one. And that's what I would say is the internally headed relative clause, where the overt head is within the relative clause, and it deletes the external head outside. Now here, things are a little more complex because there are actually two families of internally headed relative clauses, at least two. And one is quite well known because it has been studied by Williamson in the case of Lakota, an Amerindian language, but also other Amerindian languages, Nigueño, Mojave, studied by Gorbet and Monroe, which show the following cluster of properties. An indefinite restriction. This means that the internal head can only, well, let me say it in the a negative way, cannot be preceded by demonstratives, universal quantifiers, definite articles. It can only contain an indefinite article, a numeral, an adjective, but none of the strong quantifiers, the strong determiners. Now, notice that this follows directly, I mean for this family, from the indefinite, the necessary indefinite nature of the external head. Remember what I said earlier, that the external head is that portion of the extended projection of the dp that is below the relative clause and is a fortiori below all the strong determiners like the, those, all, most. So it's not surprising then that there is a family at least of internally headed relative clauses that shows exactly this indefinite restriction, because that follows, at least for this family of internally headed relatives, from the indefinite nature of the external head, if nothing happens. That is the consequence. Not only that, but the indefinite restriction goes with possibility of stacking. Williamson's for Lakota says that, and for the absence of island constraints and island sensitivity. So that means that there was no movement at all of the internal head. See, so the three properties go together. So indefiniteness, restriction, non-sensitivity to islands, possibility of stacking. Remember that stacking was impossible with raising. With the clear cases where you had to raise the internal head. We saw also that if you raise the internal head, you expect sensitivity to islands. And these seem to show that this family of internally headed relative clauses does not involve movement of the head that you see, which is internal. And indefinite restriction gives further confirmation for the fact that nothing happened, because if nothing happened, the internal head has to be identical to the external head, which is indefinite. So that has to be indefinite itself. However, there is also a complication that other languages like Japanese, Korean, Quechua, Navajo, and some others do not show any indefinite restriction. This has been noted in the literature once the analysis of Lakota was published, and even before actually. However, interestingly, together with the absence of the indefiniteness restriction, you also find in this other family of internally headed relative clauses sensitivity to islands and impossibility of stacking. Now, we saw that these two things show that there must be some movement. Sensitivity to island imposes that the head that you see has moved. Otherwise, there should not be no sensitivity to islands. And the fact that you cannot have stacking also shows that there was an internal head that had moved out. So this is the more costly assumption that we have to make, that I have to make, namely that what happens is what you see in 43. So the internal head moves and deletes the external one, but then some of the elements inside the relative clause move up above the strong determiners, so that you give the impression of not having an indefinite restriction, because you are now having something of the relative clause which sandwiches the strong determiners. So has moved up so that, I mean, this has to be worked out more carefully, but I think that the two facts of sensitivity to islands and impossibility of stacking are a clear indication that the head that you see has moved. We is one possibility to analyze it. Now, very quickly now, double-headed, well, these are what you actually expect to exist. If there is an internal and an external head, there are languages, apparently Combine has this double-headed strategy as the predominant one. It also can delete the internal head, or for that matter, it can have a functional noun or classifier like person, thing, as external head, and the internal head being full. And the idea is that, it has been proposed by Kane, is that all full nouns are actually classified by these silent elements. So when I say a book, I'm saying really a book thing, although I don't pronounce thing. And in certain languages, this thing comes up, and you can say, or the cat animal. And in certain languages, you actually say the cat animal, some Australian languages, for example. So in 51E, you actually have something like the person, the man died, or rather, the man died person, meaning the person that died, the man that died. What about, now these are the four cases that are the prototypical cases that you expect. The externally headed postnominal, externally headed prenominal, the head internal type, and the double-headed. What about the other three? Now the other three are the headless, which seems to provide a problem, because if the structure is always double-headed, here you don't even see one head. However, I would a little bit outrageously propose what you see in 52, that actually you have two heads. So when you say, I don't like what you said, you actually, or he weighs what you weigh, you actually have the internal head that accompanies the WH, so in this case, thing, and you have the external head. And since these are classifiers or functional nouns, they can be omitted. And the same, I mean, these are the typical functional nouns like thing, amount, place, time, person. And these WH are clearly suggesting what kind of functional noun is accompanying the WH. So where goes with place, and sometimes with thing, if you have where of and so on. But let's say place, what goes with thing or amount, when with time, and whoever with person. So that is the. In fact, there are languages where the dummy head has to be pronounced. So there are languages that I cite some here, where you cannot say, I like what you said, but you have to say, I like the thing that you said, where this comes up as an external head, so to speak. Correlatives are, correlatives are the other special construction that we saw, but they are actually a subkind of each one of the constructions that we saw so far. First of all, as I said, it seems that no language has correlatives as the only strategy. So correlatives, if you take Hindi or Indo-Aryan languages, you also have post-nominal externally headed relative clauses. In other languages, you have internally headed relative clauses. So, for example, let me just read here. In the typical case of Hindi, which is one of the possibilities of Hindi, so which girl standing is, that girl tall is, where there is an apparent external head, but really is something in the main clause that resumes a left dislocated relative clause. So it's like saying in Italian, but also I guess in Russian, the book that I read yesterday, well, that book I don't like at all, where you have a DP containing a relative clause which is dislocated, and then you resume it even with the demonstrative. Generally, the resumption is with the pronoun, but you can resume it with the relative clause. Now, the case of apparently headless or free relative clause is 54D. This is from Marathi, so you can say, which girl, home went, her or that, here lives. But notice what I put the zeros there, namely there you have an external head which is not pronounced, and it's actually pronounced in 55A. That girl, who, which, home went, that, the girl is not pronounced, here lives. But apparently, even in Hindi, you can have the whole structure. So you can say, that girl, which girl home went, that girl here lives. It's somewhat redundant, but it's apparently accepted. 55A gives a case of a correlative based on the left dislocation of an externally headed prenominal. So it's that who is standing woman, that child, that woman is tall. And 55B gives a case of a correlative, resumed by that, of a head internal relative clause. So it's I house bought, that burned down. So it looks as if correlatives are simply left dislocated relative clauses which can be of the externally headed postnominal, externally headed prenominal, internally headed. So that's the. And finally, adjoined, some people have analyzed them as also correlatives, some other people have analyzed them extraposed relative clauses, but they don't seem to be the only strategy that is present in the language. So that makes sense to say that the typical, the basic four type are the externally headed postnominal, those externally headed prenominal, internally headed, and double-headed. There is no language that has only free relatives. So, because free relatives is a subtype of the one of the other four, and the same with correlatives. So I'll stop here.
So, questions, yeah?
I wanted to ask, are dummy heads always external?
No, they can also be internal.
Also.
Yeah.
I have a question about inverse attraction constructions. So you say that if we have extra position, we can't have inverse attraction because the head is external. But it seems
No,
that,
because the head came from the side.
No, I mean if there is extra position, we cannot have inverse attraction because the head is not from. Or
No,
okay.
well, I took it as one example of a case where, together with others, whenever you have evidence of some type that the overt head, the one you actually hear, has to have come from inside the relative clause, the raising construction, then for some reason, which I did not discuss and it's not entirely clear, extraposition is impossible. Now, the inverse case attraction is one case where you have some evidence that the head of the relative clause, because it has that particular case, which can only have a reason from inside the relative clause, must involve raising. And since raising is incompatible with extraposition, then you find that extraposition is not possible exactly when you have inverse case attraction. I don't know if it's clear enough.
Yes, but I think that maybe there are other reasons why inverse attraction is not possible in extraposition, because, for instance, because the predicate of the main clause, which gives the case to the head, is just closer to the head than the relative clause, so I have a data from phenotypic languages which also have this inverse attraction, and it is also prohibited, so it is also ungrammatical. Then the head is in genitive construction, so I mean it depends from other noun which precedes the head of the relative clause, and so I mean the inverse attraction may be ungrammatical in the presence of other element which is closer and which gives the case to the head.
Yeah, well, it's not entirely clear. It depends very much on what structure you assign. I mean, if you have, because, I mean, if you have the head of the relative clause in the subject position, then you expect, of course, the predicate of the main clause to really force its case on that. But the question is that I had something in mind. It's still not clear, you know, what I mean, the restrictions that you find on these internally, inverse attraction, namely that at least in Farsi, I also found an article on some Finno, maybe it's you, I don't know, it's not, where exactly the inverse case attraction, the author notes, it's a woman, so that it's not you, who notes that you also cannot extrapose when you have a case which is different, right? I don't remember it now, I don't have it here. But, now, it's somewhat strange that you should find the restriction that you find. Namely, these inverse case attractions are only possible in subject position. They are not possible, I don't know about Finno-Ugric, but certainly in Farsi, you cannot have them in object position or in other position.
Yes, it's the same.
And I think that there is a straightforward reason for that. Namely, that you can have this very special violation, apparent violation of the assignment of the matrix verb to its subject when the relative clause is not in subject position. So, as I said earlier, it's only when you topicalize the DP and you resume it with a nominative pronoun, so that the predicate gives nominative to the resumptive pronoun, which may be silent, and that's the only case. It's like saying in English, you know, in these hanging topic constructions, me, I always thought that I was where you have a mismatch of case because there is no reconstruction of the element that you have left dislocated. So you can have, typically the default case in English is accusative, but then you can take it up with a nominative. But you can only do it, of course, you cannot say, I think that me is, or me, I'm something. So it's only when you have it externally. So if you grant that, then that does not follow from a functional analysis which says it's the closest element that gives you, it seems to me, because that says nothing about these restrictions. You see what I mean? But I don't know. It's, I mean, there could be other reasons, but it's very striking that there are these restrictions. And I think the only way to explain them is to say that you are allowed to do inverse case attraction when the head has nothing to do with the matrix verb or with other case assignment.
I can ask another question, but
Yeah,
there are other people who want. So it's there is I don't think that it is a nominative position in phenomenon languages, but it is clause initial position. So it may be the dative argument, but it must be in the beginning of the sentence. And I mean that in case of blocking of inverse attraction in sentences with extraposition, it may be because of these reasons and not because of the nature of the head. Yes.
Yeah, I see what you mean. But I still think that, I mean, the initial position, what does the initial position mean for you?
Left, on the
No,
left.
no, but in the structure of the sentence.
So, you would like to say that it must be topicalized? Or
Sure, yeah, that's the only, I mean, otherwise it's mysterious why you can only do it in front of the...
But I mean, the topical position is normally dative, is normally nominative and not dative. So if the head is dative and
But the dative is assigned
from yeah.
from within, and the nominative could be taken by the external head. I mean, that's the... No, I mean, there could be other reasons, that's true. But I find it very striking that there are these restrictions on anyway, if you have other factors.
More questions?
Yeah, if I may. Consider a section of correlative clauses. So, assuming that it should be the entire decay being left dislocated and then resumed by some definite phrase, how could you personally extend the analysis from the single-headed correlatives to the multiple ones? Because if you continue to stick on to this idea expressed in 55A and B, you will immediately run into the problems of multiple analysis or multiple heads and one relative clause.
Right. So there are correlatives which sound like this. Which girl beated which boy? That girl. And these have been shown not to be relative clauses, but concessive type of agent clauses. Like no matter what, no matter which girl beat which boy, that girl was in love with that boy, something like that. But in particular, and also I think Pancheva shown that because you have them also in Bulgarian, you have them possibly in Russian, I don't know.
Both types of it, actually.
No?
There are both types of it, both single-headed and multiple-headed.
Yeah, but they should be kept apart. In fact, but shows that one is sensitive to islands. This is particularly of Hindi, not of all languages, and he analyzes that by generating together which girl, that girl, and then moving out which girl from and so he gets the island sensitivity. In Bulgarian, you don't have island sensitivity, so Pancheva analyzes them as being generated. No, I think they are quite different. They are CPs, not DPs, and that's why you can have more apparent heads, but it's a different interpretation. It's like no matter what.
Not really, because it can get both universal reading and both unique reading, meaning that there is that given pair of girls and boys
Well,
are
yeah.
using same action B and same action A, whatever remains to be said about the clauses.
Yeah. Well, I guess you have more or less to look into the facts and see whether there is really a DP or only a CP
Because
that
even-
allows you. Clearly, you cannot have a relative clause there because you would have two heads. That's impossible.
Because even if you take a single-headed correlative, so as not to ruin the whole picture, you may also find that there is virtually no language employing this same correlativization strategy, which is being left dislocated and at the same time marked with, with case as a whole, right? With a silent head for correlative, and then whatever is left with, namely the clause, being marked by a case.
I'm not sure I
morpheme.
followed, but yeah. I mean, one has to look into each language and see what happens. I don't think one can really generalize completely, except for, theory internally, when you have two, which it cannot be a relative clause. So you expect a number of things out of that, and at least for Hindi and some other languages that has been shown, or Bulgarian. Then you have to look into the language and see what it would be. Right, anyway. So we may not agree on that, but right.
Okay, I think we should stop here.
Not the language.